Can you hire a canine unit to sniff out your teen's stash? Nowadays, yeah. But the better question is, should you? Today I'm going to talk about the weird world of ethical concerns of drug sniffing dogs on demand. So if you're anything like me, you might not have even thought about renting a drug sniffing dog as a possibility. And I didn't think about it until I saw a Facebook post from my local Facebook group, which is where I get all of my drug drama now. And the post was basically like, hey, where is a local place that I can rent a canine unit? Now, everybody in the comment section was like, oh, did you lose your stash? Har har. But then people were like, no, seriously, I would love to rent one for my teenagers too. Where can I? Now, as a drug scientist, this brought up all sorts of ethical quandaries, so now I get to explain them to you. So can anyone just hire a drug sniffing dog? It turns out basically yes. So there are companies that are all around the United States that basically rent out dogs that have been trained and certified to work as drug sniffing dogs. And there are websites that basically say like, hey, here are all the places that you can use it. So you can use it in your private business to see if your employees are using drugs. You can hire them for your school, but you can also hire them to search your own private residence. The ethics of having drug sniffing dogs in each of these places is different. So for example, they suggest that you can use a drug sniffing dog at a rehab clinic, which in some ways might make sense. If you were trying to help people quit drugs, you don't necessarily want them in there in the first place, or at least you want people to be honest about using them. So that one seems a little less unethical than something like schools, and potentially a little less unethical than something like landlords using it to search apartments. But the existence of the dogs in the first place mean that they can be used for basically any of these locations. And they use a variety of different ways to suggest why people might be wanting to use this, other than just wanting to see if somebody uses drugs. So they're like, yeah, so these drug dogs can actually detect nicotine. And right now we have a lot of COVID going on. And so maybe people are just like sharing their vapes and that's causing COVID. So maybe you need this nicotine sniffing dog to make sure that your teen is not going to get COVID. Y'all, that's not just a big leap. That's an Olympic-sized jump. But they're offering these as safe, non-police ways of actually figuring out if somebody is trying to kind of hide drugs. So let's get into some of these ethical issues. The first one is false positives. First, they are relatively effective. So what I mean by effective is that in about 90% of cases, they are correctly hitting on a substance that's actually there. So they're finding something that was hidden. But they also have about 5% of false positives, and this can play a huge role in somebody who's using a drug sniffing dog to kind of gain evidence against something. And how effective they are depends seemingly on the breed and also the location. So German Shepherds were the best, and the location that seems to be the worst is a car. Their accuracy was only around like 60% in cars. So they can sniff out basically most of the drugs. So the easiest one for them is, unsurprisingly, weed, but they can also sniff out blow and speed and molly and H and fen and other opioids as well. And like this online site that I could hire a drug sniffing dog from also says that it can be used to sniff out nicotine. But like nicotine is actually a specialty drug because most canine units are not trained on nicotine. Like why would you be? It's legal. And weirdly, to be certified, each dog has to be trained on like 2 different drugs, and there's a maximum amount of drugs that they can be trained on, and they also can't be co-trained on explosives. So there's all sorts of weird rules around this. So yeah, it is actually pretty likely that a trained canine unit will be able to accurately find weed. Like there's a reason that it's called skunky. But there are still false positives, and we need to figure out what that means in the case of private drug dogs. Because this brings up all sorts of weird legal issues. Like, who is allowed to use a drug dog? So can parents just hire one for their teenagers? Probably it is their house. But what if they find a drug? Or what if the drug dog finds a lot of drugs? Are the drug dog handlers required to tell the police that? It seems like, based on what I've seen, that the handlers say that they will only tell the police if it's a large amount of the substance, or something like they discovered a meth lab. But what is a large amount of substance? And what happens if they discover it and turn it into the police, and then you're the one who gets in trouble? Can you say like, well, I hired the drug dog, so obviously it's not my fault? And what if we're talking about other people trying to get in your business? I've heard a lot of neighbor horror stories. So I've heard one where the neighbor actually reported their neighbor for drug use to the adoption agency that they got their animal from. Like wrote to them and basically said, yeah, so this person smokes a lot of weed. You should not have adopted an animal to them. Like, I am fairly certain that that type of neighbor would then hire a canine unit if they could. What about landlords? Should they be allowed to bring in a drug sniffing dog? So I grew up in Section 8 housing and I never realized how weird it was to have inspections all the time. But my husband grew up in like the same house since childhood that his family owned. And he was like, yeah, I never had my house inspected for anything. He never had a landlord. He never had to deal with that. So should we allow landlords to actually use something like a drug sniffing dog? Is this something that should be allowed for the government to use for people in specifically federally funded housing? Because you can see that slippery slope a mile away. So there are actually different rules for landlords versus somebody who owns their home. So the United States Supreme Court found that a drug dog was not allowed on the front porch of somebody's personally owned home. But a state Supreme Court, specifically North Dakota, ruled that a drug dog was allowed in the hallways of apartment buildings. So two different rules for two different sets of people. And you can easily see how this ruling is problematic for people. So what we see is that people who typically have lower incomes are more likely to live in apartments, so they're more likely to actually have the drug dog be allowed to kind of search them. Whereas people who are wealthier and are more likely to own their own home are far less likely to have someone invade their personal space with a canine unit. And going back to this main idea, should parents be even allowed to do this? There are all sorts of debates about whether parents should be allowed to drug test their kids, which I can go off on in another video if you want me to. But we need to ask this question of, can parents actually bring in a canine unit? Should they? What are consequences of this for their children? And finally, there are suggestions that canine units in private spaces could actually cause more harm. So for example, there's been an uptick in canine units in places like Australia, specifically at things like clubs. And they say that this deters drug deals at clubs, which it seems like it does according to the science, but it might actually make people less likely to use in a public space. Which doesn't seem that bad until you realize that then they're basically sent to private spaces, which are actually riskier for drug use. And they also say that they're more likely to just then take the entire stash to not be caught, which is also troublesome. You're then more likely to overdose or have a really bad time, like Super Troopers taught me. So what do you think about this? This is something that's going to be coming up a lot more often. And with the shifting legality of drugs and the stigma associated with them, this is something we really need to be thinking about.